All set and starting the broadcast now. So,
Right. Good afternoon. I'm Councillor David Guest, Chairman of today's Planning Committee meeting. In addition to the councillors who sit on the committee, the following officers are in attendance. Julia Mancy, Development and Building Control Manager. Daphne Haywood, Principal Planning Officer. David Haywood, Planning Policy Manager. Jill Glover, Policy Planning Officer. Steve Weaver, Development Manager. Rosanna Begum, Solicitor. Mark Gregory, Democratic Services Officer. David Penrose, Democratic Services Officer. Can I please ask all in attendance to note that this meeting has been recorded and will be published on the Council's website. IP addresses are not collected. However, in order for it to function, Skype for Business collects background data limited to when a user enters and leaves the meeting and the web browser version used. Data collected will be kept and recorded for the purpose of this meeting only. If at any point a member of the committee loses their connection, I shall adjourn the meeting for a short period to allow them to reconnect. As a reminder, if a member of the committee is not present for the whole duration of the item, they are precluded from voting. Could I please request that councillors and officers present at this meeting to mute their calls after they have finished speaking. If you have unmuted yourself for any reason, could I please ask you to remain silent whilst waiting to speak. As we have guests in the meeting, I ask that the conversation pane should not be used unless you have a technical issue such as an audio failure and you wish to contact Democratic Services. I shall now outline how the meeting will run. The Democratic Services Officer will inform the meeting of apologies for absence received from members of the committee and the names of any substitute councillors sitting in their place. I shall undertake a roll call of the councillors present. For the efficiency of the meeting, I shall also ask the councillors at this point to confirm whether they have read the supplementary papers, the deputations received, and whether they have any interest to declare on any of the items being considered at this meeting. I shall then take each item on the agenda in turn. The relevant officer will introduce the item, including answers to questions submitted by committee members prior to this meeting, and where appropriate, display a presentation visible to all parties, including members of the public watching proceedings online. We shall hear the verbal deputations from those who have requested to speak at this meeting. I shall then allow each member of the committee to ask questions. Once questions have been answered, I shall move on to debate. This will take the same format by giving members an opportunity to put their views to the meeting. If at any point I feel that a response or intervention is required from an officer, I shall ask the relevant officer to speak. If at any point during the debate a member of the committee puts forward a motion, I shall ask them to clearly repeat the wording of the motion. I will then ask for a seconder. When seconding a motion, please unmute your microphones and state your name. At this point, I shall ask each councillor if they wish to speak. Debate shall centre solely on the motion. After the members have concluded the debate on a motion, I shall ask officers for their comments on that motion. I shall then ask the committee to vote. For clarity, I shall request that a recorded vote be taken and each committee member in turn to state for, against, or abstain. Once the vote has been taken, I shall ask the Democratic Services Officer to read out the number of councillors who voted for, against, or abstained. If the motion is carried, I shall declare the outcome. If lost, I shall resume the debate until another motion is put forward. At the conclusion of the debate and voting, the committee will have made a decision. At the conclusion of all items on the agenda, I shall close the meeting. So I shall begin the meeting with the roll call and declarations. Mr. Gregory, do we have any apologies for absence?
Hello, Mr. Chairman. I can confirm that there are no apologies. All members are present.
Thank you. As a member of the committee, I can confirm that I have read the officer's report, deputations received and supplementary agenda, and have no interest to declare on any of the items being considered at this meeting. Councillor Keith, can you please confirm your attendance, whether you have read the officer's report, supplementary papers and the public deputations received, and state whether you have any interest to declare on any of the items being considered at this meeting?
Thank you, Chairman. I confirm my attendance. I have read all the papers relative to tonight's meeting and I have no interest to declare.
Councillor Lowe, can I please ask the same of you?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I confirm my attendance. I have read the officer's report, supplementary papers and deputations received, and I have no interest to declare.
Thank you. Councillor Patel.
Thank you, Chair. I can confirm my attendance and that I've read the report and the supplementary papers and I have no interest to declare.
Thank you. Councillor Pike.
Good evening, Chairman. I confirm my attendance. I've read the papers for this meeting and I have no interest to declare.
Thank you. Councillor Robinson.
Good evening, Chairman. I can confirm my attendance and that I have read the papers and I have no interest to declare.
Thank you. Councillor Mrs. Shimbart.
Thank you, Chairman. I confirm my attendance. I have read all the relevant papers and I have no interest to declare.
Thank you. I shall proceed to the application to be considered this afternoon. Item 3 on the agenda, Roman 1 in brackets, land at Sinah Lane, Hayling Island, APP/20/01093. Mrs. Haywood, would you please like to introduce the application? Could you also please include in your presentation answer to the pre-submitted questions and highlight any new issues in your verbal updates? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Right, in terms of the planning application, it is a proposal for residential development and a Wader and Brent Geese refuge as set out on this slide for 195 dwellings. It is a resubmission of the application considered under the 2018 application, which was considered by committee in October of last year. In terms of that application, it was originally scheduled for the 26th of March, but was cancelled owing to the COVID restrictions. Following the cancellation, the applicant lodged an appeal with the Planning Inspectorate against non-determination. So we now have a valid appeal running in progress in respect to that application. To inform the Council's case in respect to that appeal, the application, as I say, was considered at the 29th of October, and that's when the committee resolved or determined that the head of planning be authorised to inform the Planning Inspectorate that had an appeal not been lodged, the local planning authority would have been minded to grant planning permission subject to a section 106 agreement. And that has formed the basis, or that forms the basis for the Council's case at appeal. Now that appeal is in the form of an informal hearing, and whilst we now have a start date for that appeal, we do not have a date for the hearing as yet. So in terms of the changes between the 2018 application and the current application, these are very modest. They involve a change to some house types, although in terms of bulk and relationship with the neighbouring properties, they are very similar, and I will come on to that further on in the presentation. There is also a change in relation to the shape of the suds basin, which has been elongated, and again I will identify that further in the presentation. There have, however, been no material changes to the nature of the proposal in respect to the planning considerations, which are set out in detail in the report, and in particular the planning considerations have regard to the visual impact on neighbouring properties, highway considerations, drainage, ecology and archaeology. The recommendation is to approve with conditions in the section 106, as was the case in respect to the 2018 application, which is now at appeal, but members, when they did consider that, resolved that had they been able to grant, to determine the application, they would have granted permission. So I think this is where, David, are you taking over from here?
I am Daphne, yes, thank you.
Thank you. I'll stop sharing now then.
Could you please announce who you are?
So committee, this is David Hayward, Planning Policy Manager. Mark, are you able to bring back the presentation? Sorry.
Stop sharing. Pardon?
Thank you so much. So my element of the presentation is in relation to the housing supply position that the borough is in at this point. This is the one change in terms of the context within which the determination of this application will take place compared to when the Development Management Committee considered the previous application last year. At that point, the borough had a 5.4-year housing land supply. That is above the threshold of 5 years that the government sets, albeit only marginally. Since that time, the council has published an updated 5-year supply position, and as well as that, government have also published the housing delivery test requirements, which confirms that due to under-delivery over the previous 3 years, a 20% buffer, as opposed to the previous 5% buffer, should be included within our 5-year supply calculations. These two together further reduce our housing land supply, and at this point in time it is at 4.2 years, clearly below the 5-year threshold. This scheme, the planning application before the committee tonight, is in our 5-year supply and makes a meaningful contribution to it. If we could forward on to the next slide, please. The fact that the housing delivery test and housing supply position is where it is also means that the presumption in favour of sustainable development, paragraph 11D2, kicks in. That section of the NPPF sets out that the council should grant planning permission for schemes for new housing unless any adverse impacts of doing so would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits when assessed against the NPPF as a whole. This ultimately means that the benefit of housing should be considered very strongly in the application, in the determination of this planning application. Housing supply is always material for any planning application proposing new homes. However, the difficult position that the borough finds itself in with regards to housing supply means that this is a material consideration of great weight in your determination of this application. I'll hand back to Mrs. Hayward at this point.
Right, thank you, David. Right, proceeding with the presentation, the slide shows the location. The application site is edged in red. You'll see to the top of this application site is the harbour, and to the south, west and east lies residential development. In particular, I would point out that to the west, between the harbour and the application site, is North Shore Road, and then directly to the south is the residential development in Sinah Lane. So in terms of accessibility of the site, you will have identified in the report that there has been concern about the highway infrastructure and the connectivity to existing facilities, and as a result concern about reliance on the car. This plan does indicate the location of the park, the school, and also you will see there a walking route to school, the medical centre. So in terms of accessibility, all these facilities are located within reasonable distance of the application site, which is the red circle, which is located in the top left-hand corner of this slide. So going back to the location of the site relative to the surrounding development, just a little bit more detail in terms of its relationship with the harbour, which is the subject of a number of conservation designations. And again, looking at the relationship with the harbour and showing the harbour at a low tide state. You will also see that existing areas are greenfield and areas that are being built up. So as set out at the beginning, the proposal has two elements to it: the housing site, which lies on the southern part of the field, and the bird refuge, which lies on the northern part. The bird refuge is proposed to be transferred to the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds to provide permanent refuge for the birds. They would take on not only the ownership, but the control and the ongoing maintenance issues associated with this. And that was to be the subject of a legal agreement. So in terms of the character of the area, primarily residential and agricultural. So the site is a housing allocation in the emerging local plan H26. This is the proposed housing layout, an application for 195 dwellings, comprising a mix of 2, 3 and 4 bedroom properties. There are a mixture of 2-storey, some 2.5-storey, and also flats which are located towards the centre of the site. There are also elements of green space, providing for play area and open space to serve the proposed residents, but also would be open to the public to use as well. In terms of the bird refuge, this is the winter bird mitigation plan, and it shows the relationship and also a number of elements in terms of access and boundary treatment. In particular, along the eastern boundary of the site, where it borders onto the land owned by the County Council and the Hayling Trail, there would be additional planting and fencing going in there to secure the refuge. Looking at the boundary of the site with North Shore Road, again there would be further planting going in there as well to provide a more appropriate habitat, bearing in mind the proposed use. Within this area you can also see the Suds Basin. That's located in the bottom corner, the oval shape with a projecting northward element, and this would not form part of the land to be transferred to the RSPB, although it would remain in a form where the birds could make use of it should they choose to, and any access to that area would be strictly controlled for maintenance purposes of the SUDs. So providing a little bit more detail and just giving you a bit more of a key to show the proposal in terms of the infill hedging, and also the new hedging, vehicular access to the site. The proposal also provides for education boards to provide some information for anybody who is in the area as to why the area is fenced off and the facility it provides, or the mitigation that it provides. This plan has been developed in association with the RSPB, and in particular they have identified that there are certain desired paths in this area, and that in order to accommodate that, it's better to accommodate that and then put in fencing and screening to mitigate the impacts of people using that, and in that way discourage unauthorised access to that area. So you will have seen in the representations that there was some mitigation proposed under the Oysters development. That's the development that lies further to the east of Station Road, and in particular you will see on that plan there are three red crosses on the boundary with the Hayling Billy, and it is those locations were identified as areas where the fencing was damaged because there were informal footpaths created into the area. Now there will remain an ongoing requirement under the Oysters mitigation for that fencing to be retained, and the developer has recently carried out works in that respect. It is an ongoing issue because people do damage the fence in seeking to gain access to that area and across to the coast. As part of this proposal, and I'll come on to the layout plan in a moment, there would be two proposed connections to the Hayling Billy, one towards the northern part of the residential development, proposed residential development, and one towards the southern. This would provide a formalised route for people to access the coast and the footpath network, and that could be done by those links and through a small section of the proposed housing allocation onto existing informal paths. So in terms of surface water drainage, you will have seen from the representations and the report, and also further on in this presentation there are slides, that the site does suffer from surface water which settles, and it is actually a clay and therefore with poor drainage. The proposal is to positively convey the water north, piping it through a pumped system, and there is a proposed pumping station which is to be adopted by Southern Water together with the Fowl pumping station. So a positive outlet for the water. From the pumping station it would go to attenuation basin, which would then go out to existing ditches and then out to the sea. As part of this drainage system there would be filtration to remove pollutants, and certainly the issue of pollutions in the harbour is a major concern, and that it is important to have this filtration in place. You will see that as part of the proposal there are also two large storage tanks as identified on this slide, which would act to hold the water should it be necessary, and together with the attenuation basin the water would be held should the situation of the tide be high, and then once the tide had fallen the water could then be released into the harbour. I did refer earlier on to the fact that the application site for the housing lies beyond the properties in North Shore Road in respect to its relationship with the harbour. There has been concern expressed about the fact that with high tides that exerts pressure on the underground water systems, which impact the surface water levels, and hence concerns about flooding. I think the relevant point here is actually to consider that firstly the pressure when you are set back from the harbour beyond existing development is limited, and that also if this were a significant problem, then it would have been one that would have arisen in the properties in North Shore Road. So it's considered that this issue actually is not significant in terms of the surface water drainage strategy. So in terms of the highway works, and in particular the highway network on Hayling Island, you'll be aware of the Hayling Island transport assessment and mitigation set out in their report. This proposal would provide a contribution to that. In particular, that scheme looks at improvements along the A3023 corridor, improvements to Northerny Road and the A3023, Langston Road, Woodbury Avenue and the Technology Park, West Lane and the A3023, the Millrise roundabout and friction reduction schemes along the A3023. One of the questions that arose at site viewing related to the spending of this money and the timing in respect to this development, and I will go into that in more detail, having regard to the response from Hampshire County Council in respect to the updates. However, the monies proposed would go towards these proposed improvements. So going back to the proposal itself and the affordable housing, this application provides for 30% affordable rent and shared ownership as indicated on this plan. The proposal in terms of the affording housing provision has been assessed by the Council's housing officer, who is satisfied with what is proposed in terms of its location and its form, and that would be subject to a legal agreement. In terms of storey heights, a mix of stories. In particular, I would draw your attention to the 2.5-storey properties, which are hatched in blue. Where they back onto existing residential development, it is in terms of a roof light serving that top storey, and not in terms of dormers of full height. And there is a plan further on in the presentation which shows the elevations to these properties. Also, I draw your attention to the green shading, which is the 3-storey flats. As you can see, they are centrally located and there are 18 of these flats. Earlier on in the presentation, I discussed the link that's been proposed from the site to the Hayling Billy, the 2 links. In particular, I draw your attention to the northern link. I think you can probably faintly work out on this slide. On the eastern side is the path, which is the Hayling Billy. It connects through to the proposed residential development, and then anybody wishing to then connect on to the coast could do so through the existing residential development, through just a small part, and then onto the access gate that is provided where the site adjoins the bird refuse area. So it is proposed that the roads and also those 2 links to the Hayling Billy, as far as they fall within the application site, would be adopted. This site also shows the location of the pumping stations, one for foul water and one for surface water. It is proposed that the application would be phased, and as each phase comes forward, and there'd be 5 of these phases, there would be a proposed area of open space or play area, other than the 5th area, which is just for the 5 units. So then there would be an area for those residents to enjoy, and it's only when the development is finally completed that all of the public open space and play area provision would be provided. This is relevant because as part of this update I have received a further response, or I have received actually a first response from Hampshire County Council's countryside team, requesting that all the open space be provided at the initial construction stage, commencement of development phase, but that is not practical because of the way the site is developed in phases and because of potential conflicts with traffic. But I can provide more information on that when I give you the update on their comments. So in terms of the appearance of the proposal, it is a brick and tile construction, traditional in form. And some further street scenes showing the form of the development, the breaks that we have between properties, and therefore the visual impact. So now some examples of the properties, the house types. Further example of a 3-bedroom property, an end of terraced property, and a 4-bedroom property. So this is a 2.5-storey property, and as you can see in the rear elevation, that room, that bedroom, is served by a roof light and not a bedroom to reduce the bulk. I would also say that in terms of back-to-back distances, we do have the 24 metres set out in the council's design guide, which to provide privacy and acceptable relationship with existing dwellings. A further example of the house types and the flats. These would be brick, but also with cladding to break up the elevations. So in terms of the changes from what was considered by committee for the 2018 scheme, we have a change from a Maidstone to an Ellerton. The footprint is the same, the bulk of development is the same. However, a comparison of the elevations shows that in terms of the front elevation, we have changes to the position of the doors and also changes to the first floor windows, in that we now have a bedroom and a bathroom at first floor, whereas previously we had 2 bedroom, and therefore in terms of the rear elevation we now have 2 bedrooms rather than a bedroom and a bathroom. Now, because a number of these number of the Maidstone actually back onto existing residential properties, where that is the case, they will remain as the Maidstone and will not be changed to the Ellerton. And the other change, or one of the other changes, the Kenley to the Denford. We have changes to the front elevation, however the rear elevation remains unaltered, and the footprint and bulk remains the same. Changes to the 4-bedroom dwelling. There is a small increase in the floor area of this property and changes to the design. There is only one that is adjacent to the site boundary with an existing residential property, and that is located side on, and that'll the impact on that property is not considered to be adverse. So turning to the relationship with the existing residential properties, this slide, in this case south is actually at the top, so it's been rotated 180 degrees in terms of north-south, but it shows the existing properties in 2 to 14 Sinah Lane. Then the lower half of the slide shows the outline of those properties and the proposed residential development that would back onto those properties, and gives an indication of the separation distance we have window to window. And you can see that I've identified a 30-metre separation in respect to the plot 191 with the existing dwelling that lies to the rear. In comparison, the Borough Design Guide requires a minimum window-window separation for two-storey development of 20 metres. So this is a slide indicating the view from number 6 Sinah Lane. I would say that these slides taken from the existing residential properties have been provided by the occupants. Because of the COVID restrictions, it's not been possible to visit those, and indeed when we did the site briefing, it was not possible to view, although members were provided with a video of the site and also these slides. So this shows the property. This is one of the properties that would adjoin the access drive, and also the outlook onto the existing field. And a further view from this property looking across to the field. The existing planting does provide some screening during the summer, although during the winter that is much less so. And again from 6 Sinah Lane. And a further slide from 14 Sinah Lane, where you can see the surface water, and there is an existing issue with drainage of the site. As set out earlier in the presentation, this proposal provides a positive route for that water, yet also builds in measures to hold back the water in the event of high tide, and also storage measures as well, together with filtration. So looking at 16 to 28 Sinah Lane, and I've indicated a back-to-back distance in the region of 26 metres for the proposed dwelling at 180, plot 180, and also an indication of the minimum garden depth there of 10 metres, which is in accordance with the Council's Borough Design Guide. And this is a view from 28 Sinah Lane. The existing properties do have an open view over the field, and this obviously will be significantly changed. So in terms of 22 to 30 Sinah Lane and indicating the back-to-back distances, I think actually I said that the back-to-back distance in respect to the 2.5-storey development was 24 metres. It is actually 26 metres, as indicated on the bottom half of that slide on the left part. And then this is actually the street scene for those plots in that run of properties. And you can see on the lower part the 2.5-storey property with the dormers to the front. And then in this one you can see that the 2.5-storey property with the roof lights. So this is the view that those properties would see in terms of the rear elevation of the proposed dwellings. And then turning to 16 to 14 North Shore Road, you can see that there is good level of separation, well in excess of the Borough Design Guide minimum requirement. The view from 10 North Shore Road with an open aspect over the field, and from 12 North Shore Road. 14 to 30 North Shore Road, and again The existing properties have a reasonable sized gardens. The proposed dwellings along this stretch are sited so as not to result in a particular loss of privacy, to provide good separation to windows. You will see on that slide, in terms of the lower part, within the application site, so within the red edging, but shaded in grey in the left-hand corner, is an area of land. This currently forms part of the field, but it is the applicant's intention to convey that to those owners should they wish to accept it, but that does not form part of this planning application proposal. It is a separate land matter. In terms of the view from 16 North Shore Road, it's important that members see these so that they are aware of the site in the absence of being able to visit the site. And this one is taken from 20 North Shore Road. Turning to 32 to 42 North Shore Road, these properties have substantial gardens, and this is the proposal that would back onto those properties. And the views from some of those properties. 44 to 64 North Shore Road, again, good sized gardens to provide separation and the relationship with those properties. So there, an indication of the size of gardens for the properties with the shorter gardens of 12 metres and the separation distance of 40 metres. So there now is a series of slides which are taken of the site at various times of the year, and also since 2018. And as you can see, the appearance of the site does change quite significantly depending on the time of the year. I've also included these slides, which are a couple of slides provided by local residents of the use of the site by Brent Geese. And whilst, yes, they are using them, the extent to which the birds would use the land depends on what the cropping regime is, and that is not something that is currently controlled and is at the discretion of the farmer. Therefore, by providing a permanent refuge, which is controlled by the RSPB, this would provide an area of land that was available every year to the geese. So, in terms of nutrient neutrality, as members will be aware, following the Dutch case, all developments in the borough need to be nutrient neutral. The site is currently within agricultural use. That does result in nutrients entering the environment. The need to create the Brent Goose Refuge and the relatively high nutrient load of the current agricultural use are factored into the calculations, which are undertaken using Natural England methodology. This shows that at 155.3 kilograms, there is less nitrogen entering the environment after the development compared to the current level. As such, there is no need for any further mitigation. A habitats regulation has been undertaken, and this has been subject to consultation with Natural England, who have agreed the findings. So they are satisfied that in terms of the impact of nutrients, that this proposal would be neutral. So going on forward in terms of the site, and as I said, the state of the land does vary considerably depending on the season, but there is the drainage strategy in place which has taken account of the soil conditions and the surface water that currently lies on the site to provide a positive drainage for the site. This is a slide which has been provided by a resident, showing that on occasions that the farmer will provide or take actions to drain the field, and this would no longer be required under the current scheme. In terms of, I mean, this is actually showing the eastern end of that trench, but also what it does show is that there is an issue with pollution, because you can just see that there is a white foam within that ditch area. The drainage system that is being proposed provides for filters to filter out pollutants, and as such would provide an improved situation to what exists at the moment. In terms of the relationship with the Hayling Billy, and again I can thank the residents who have provided me with this, this shows that there are informal paths that have been created to the application site by removal of the existing fencing. Under the oysters mitigation, there is a requirement to repair fencing in certain locations, and whilst this has been done on occasions, because this is a desire line, those fences do get removed and there continues to be access. So as previously identified, there are pollution issues, and there are also pollution issues in the harbour. This is from waters within the harbour where they meet the foreshore and the pollution. The proposal is nutrient neutral. The drainage provides for filtration, and as such the proposal is in that respect not considered to add to the pollution issues. However, you will have seen from the representations and the deputations that there is concern about the sewage system and that there have been various issues with it on Hayling Island. The application has been considered by Southern Water. They haven't raised any objection to the proposal, and they have not required that the development is delayed in any sense for them to provide additional infrastructure. In terms of the provision of drainage for foul sewer, this is a responsibility of Southern Water, and they have a legal duty in respect to providing this function. And they are actually carrying out improvement works on Hayling Island at the moment. There has also been concern expressed about erosion on the coast, and in particular how this relates to the proposed refuge area. The RSPB are aware of this, as are the coastal team, and having assessed it, it is not something that they have raised objection to in their consultee response. And as set out, the RSPB are looking to are looking to take ownership of this area and manage the refuse for the wintering birds. Also identified in the representations and the deputations is the highway situation, particularly as it relates to the footpaths along Station Road in terms of occupants of the proposed development accessing West Town and facilities there in places, and this slide doesn't demonstrate that, but the Deputation slide does, Deputation does make reference to this. So in places the footpath is actually very narrow. Now this has been looked at by the Highway Authority. However, having looked at it, there is no scope to actually make further improvements. Improvements were provided as part of the mitigation for the oysters, and one of those was actually to put in a crossing, and you can see that in this slide, a crossing for pedestrians so that they can cross from one side of the road to the other to make use of the areas where there are wider footpaths. The situation in terms of the highway network, or this particular part of it, is that it has evolved from a series of rural lanes which at one time had no footpaths or very limited footpaths, and that has severely limited the potential to provide further footpath provision. So an indication of the appearance of the site from properties in Sinah Lane, and again a further slide of the site. So in terms of the proposal, this sets out the conclusions and the recommendation in the report. The site does lie outside the built-up area, but there are a number of material considerations, including the 5-year housing land supply, which my colleague David Hayward has referred to. Proposal provides open space provision and a play area. There is a visual impact, but it is very localised, and we have a landscape framework plan and a condition requiring further landscaping to provide landscaping to soften the impact of the development. There is funding towards various things, including the highway network, and also in terms of healthcare and education, and also in terms of the Hayling Billy. You will see in the report that under the previous application there was an agreed funding of £8.8 thousand towards maintenance of the existing Hayling Billy. This is one element that has been negotiated under Section 106, with further elements in respect to the provision of that link, of those links between the application, the housing site and the Hayling Billy, and the ongoing maintenance involved in those. So the site can be adequately drained, it does comply with design guide, and the development mitigates any impacts on protected areas and species. And as set out previously, the appropriate assessment has been agreed by Natural England. And as referred to previously in the report, considerable weight also has to be attached to the housing land supply position. So overall there are benefits, it is considered sustainable, and the recommendation is one for permission and subject to conditions and a legal agreement. So I will now provide you the updates. You have 2 updates and also a further consultee response which was provided this afternoon. So turning to the first of those updates, which is agenda item 3, and that provides you with the response or the further comments from the county ecologist. This is an amendment to his previous response, so it's not my intention to read all of it, but what I will read is the part that relates to the oysters, which is the main change that he has made to his comments. So the relationship with the permitted oysters development has been discussed before. The mitigation for that development was supposed to include secure fencing along the eastern boundary of the Sinah Lane H34C site to prevent informal access across H34C, as well as management of a small area of pasture to the north. There was no condition relating to the ongoing management of land within the H34C, and management was therefore subject to usual cropping as determined by the landowner in response to commercial necessity. There were clearly implementation issues with the secure fencing, whilst it's highly regrettable, which is highly regrettable. I understand that this has been addressed, although it would seem from recent correspondence from a local resident that there are still issues with unauthorised access into the site. This needs addressing urgently, and certainly the security of fencing must be enforced in future. It is hoped that the addition of new hedging as a result of the current application will further secure this boundary, alongside properly securing fencing. His response then goes on to recommend conditions, and these conditions are do form part of the recommended conditions within the application, within the agenda document, but I will also identify, in terms of the second update, some slight amendments to those conditions to strengthen the protection that they provide. So also within that update report are the responses to requests from the Site Viewing Working Party for additional information. The first response relates to footpath access to the refuse. The proposed formal links to the Hayling Billy Trail from the application site would provide access to the southern and northern ends of the proposed residential development. At the northern end of the proposed residential development, an access gate is proposed to provide vehicular access to the bird refuge for authorised entry only, and to connect with the informal footpath that crosses the field and connects with the informal footpath that lies adjacent the coast to the west. The winter bird mitigation and strategy and plan provide for this. An enlarged extract from the plan will be included in the PowerPoint presentation at committee, which is what I have shown you. In terms of question 2, the oysters mitigation, as part of the mitigation for the oysters housing development, as set out in the HBC ecologist report, mitigation to that development was supposed to include secure fencing along the eastern boundary of the Sinah Lane H34C site to prevent informal access across H34C, as well as management of the small area of pasture land to the north. There have been issues with damage to the fence to gain entry, the provision of a formal connection from the Hayling Billy to the application site, together with replacement fencing, proposed hedging on the eastern boundary of the refuge, as set out in the winter bird mitigation strategy and plan, would provide a more robust boundary treatment to the bird refuge, and education boards would supplement this. Question number 3 was clarification on E26. This refers to the area, this is referred to in the report, the area adjoining the proposed refuge, and that is not correct. It lies further to the north and it lies in flood zone 3. In addition to the above responses, I now need to go on to the second update, which provides firstly an update on the community involvement, and there are 10 further objections that have been received since the report was written. However, they do not raise any new issues to those set out in the agenda. In respect to the responses to the Site Viewing Working Party's requests, the first one, further details of proposed highway changes and funding for the Hayling Island transport assessment. And I will read this out in full. Officers have liaised with representatives of the Highway Authority, who have advised as follows. With regard to funding, securing monies through the Section 106 is a usual mechanism for Highway Authority to use to secure measures that are beyond the scope of the development to deliver in full. They are used where there is cumulative harm on the highway network. Havant's emerging local plan and the supporting Hayling Island TA has identified a package of measures to mitigate the impact of the local plan development, of which Sinah Lane is part. On the basis of this wider package of improvements, a contribution has been agreed of £679,000 as the appropriate amount for the site. The money is being paid in 3 instalments, and it is anticipated that it will comprise 10% prior to occupation. I would advise you at that stage that should read prior to commencement, and that is what would be set out in the Section 106. 45% prior to first occupation, and the remainder at 50 dwellings. The first instalment will allow the Highway Authority to trigger design work on a number of improvements along the A3023 as identified within the Hayling Island TA, and to have a better understanding of the detail of these schemes and costs, and be able to prioritise delivery of the various schemes. When the Highway Authority are then in receipt of the monies, they can deliver or continue to pot build towards large schemes, or look to utilise CIL as identified would be necessary in order to deliver the Hayling Island TA requirements. This is standard practice, and the Highway Authority have to work within the limits of planning. Pot building and taking proportionate and reasonable contributions towards cumulative harm means they are able to secure more meaningful improvements in the long run. So in terms of the further questions, following on from the site briefing, the next one relates to access arrangements for refuse and whether the RSP would be repairing and monitoring the fencing for the bird refuse. So officers have liaised with representatives of the RSPB, and the existing fencing comprises perimeter fencing, and going forward would not be the responsibility of the RSPB. There would be no changes to the current position on responsibility for the existing fencing. However, the agreed internal new fencing erected as part of the proposed Sinah Lane winter bird mitigation strategy will become the responsibility of the RSPB once it is signed off and handed over. It is outside of the desired line of pedestrians, and the RSPB will be monitoring it and maintaining it. So in terms of the last question, which was for a more detailed explanation of the issues around the 5-year land supply, you will have seen the slide on this already, and also you will have been provided with an update by David Hayward during the presentation of these slides. So in terms of the application, there are a number of very complex issues involved with this, which have been the subject of extensive negotiations and review by the consultees to get to a situation where they are now able to raise no objection subject to conditions other than the response from the Langstone Harbour Board. However, this does refer to matters which have also been considered in terms of pollution and the impact on protected species, and are matters which have been considered by people such as the Lead Local Flood Authority, Natural England, and the Ecologist, and the RSPB, and raise no objection subject to conditions and legal agreement requirements. In terms of the conditions, you will note that there are a number of conditions, and in particular there are conditions having regard to concerns that have been expressed by the residents seeking additional information. In particular, I would draw your attention to the landscaping condition, and there will be a requirement for more details, and particular attention will be paid to the requirement to provide native species and underplanting, and planting that would encourage ecology. So in terms of the revised recommendation before you, and also having regard to the updated comments from the HBC ecologist, which is set out in the first update paper, there is an amendment to condition 9, an additional condition 25. So I will read the recommendation to you in this respect. And it is that the head of planning be authorised to grant planning permission for application APP/20/01093, subject to a section 106 agreement is set out in paragraph 7.1.9 above, and B, the conditions as set out in the agenda, subject to such changes or additions that the head of planning considers necessary to impose prior to issuing decisions, as amended as follows. However, I will just break off there, because before reading those, it is relevant actually to refer you to the late consultee response that we've received from Hampshire County Council Countryside Services. In summary, they are advising that, and this relates to the links to the Hayling Billy, and in particular the northern link which would go through their land. The costs, they are saying that in financial and staff resources to Hampshire County Council Service for maintaining the trail and the local nature reserve is likely to increase substantially as a result of the proposed 195 dwellings. In order to protect and conserve the Hayling Billy Nature Reserve and mitigate the negative impacts on habitats, drainage, antisocial behaviour and disturbance to biodiversity and protected species, and to protect trees and public amenity, construction of the proposed cycle path to link to provide with the development site will request an obligation which is to be secured by legal agreement. And in that they set out various works that they see as being required to provide that link, and these include tree survey, a broadwalk, culvert and head wall, ground protection, fencing and staff resources, amongst other things. Now within the, they then go on to say, in the absence of mitigation to conserve and protect the Hayling Billy Local Nature Reserve and the woodland habitat it supports, and maintenance of the surface of the Hayling Billy Trail, providing off-road leisure cycle access northwards from the development and connection to the local access countryside network, The proposals are contrary to the draft Havant Borough Local Plan, current adopted local plan policy and national planning policy guidance, and we must object to the proposal. Now, the Hampshire County Council Countryside Services have been party to the negotiations on the 106 agreement and are actively involved, and they have confirmed that they will consider to negotiate on this, as will the applicant. Currently, there is within the committee report identified a contribution of £8.8 thousand to go towards maintenance of the Hayling Billy, and this forms one of the elements that would be included within the section 106 in respect to providing this link, and also in respect to providing the southern link which joins onto that part of the Hayling Billy which is owned by Havant Borough Council. Now, within the section 106 agreement, there is a draft requirement that no development should commence until undertakings between the relevant landowners have been entered into in respect to the provision of these links. So if this matter could not be resolved and both parties indicate that they are currently continuing to negotiate on it, then the development could not be commenced. So apologies for not identifying that before I went on to the revised recommendation. I won't read it all again, other than that the recommendation is to grant planning permission subject to a section 106 agreement and the conditions as set out in the report, but condition 9 amended, and that one has been amended in respect to it refers to the report to inform the habitats regulation assessment stage. And this follows on from the comments that have been received by the ecologist, and perhaps more particular, there is an additional condition 25 that no works such as percussive piling or works with heavy machinery that would exceed the noise level of 69 dBA or a noise level otherwise agreed in writing by the local planning authority, measured at the sensitive receptors, which is the nearest point of the SPA or SPA supporting habitats, shall be undertaken during the months of October to March inclusive. And this has been provided whilst there is a construction environmental plan condition requiring the submission of such a plan. This has been provided to make it absolutely clear that noisy activities such as piling should not be carried out in the overwintering period unless it's subsequently agreed. So, Chairman, that concludes my presentation and the recommendation before committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Hayward. Members, we've now received 14 public deputations in respect of this item, 8 of whom are present to deliver them. All deputations submitted have been published on the Council's website, including the supplementary papers, and read by members of the committee. In view of the public interest shown in this application, I have, in the interests of open democracy and in accordance with the committee's adopted deputation procedure, agreed to an extension of the time allowed for deputations as follows: 5 minutes for each objector, 15 minutes for those speaking in support, and 10 minutes for those each elected members not serving on the committee. Time will start from when the deputy begins speaking. Could speakers please remember to unmute their microphones before speaking and to mute again afterwards. When a speaker has 30 seconds remaining, a bell sound will signify that the speaker should conclude their deputation in order to remain within the time limit. Once a deputation has been made, the speaker should leave this virtual meeting. A speaker will then be able to follow the remainder of the meeting via the public link on the Council's website. Ms. Law, would you like to make your deputation against this application now? Ms. Law, if you can unmute your microphone.
What are you saying?
Hello there. Yeah, I thought I was third on the list.
Well,
after Mrs.
my script puts you at the top, so you've been
That's
promoted.
fine. Right, well, I will go first then. Thank you very much. Okay. All right.
Go ahead.
New evidence highlights the environmental importance of this site and serious risks to new and existing residents. An ever-present groundwater bulge under this site continues to raise questions. Even in summer, our rear garden soakaways contain continually replenished underground fresh water, rising and falling with the tide at an amplitude of 10 centimetres, despite being 800 yards from the harbour. Barratt Homes' borehole data confirms groundwater movement and that it lies as close as 45 centimetres below the surface. But only 2 out of the 6 boreholes have been working, and new data from the replacement boreholes this winter is now being chased by the lead local flood authority. The forecasted rise in tidal height is 1.4 metres in 100 years. Groundwater levels will increase. The lead local flood authority is very concerned about groundwater mixing with surface water in the attenuation pond, an obstruction of the northerly drainage flow from existing gardens which alleviates their own surface water flooding and must not be made worse by the development. This whole field is currently a successful primary support site for Brent geese. It includes mitigation for the oysters and covers 12.4 hectares, yet only 5.7 hectares will replace it as an on-site refuge. Natural England have stated more land is needed to mitigate for the land lost to both the oysters and this development, and must be adjacent to and the on-site refuge preventing further fragmentation of the special protection area. But it is not adjacent. It is separated by the salt marsh and east of the Billy Trail, completely within flood zone 3, rapidly eroding with coastal erosion. Although labelled the Hayling Island Bird Refuge by Havant Borough Council, it is currently just farmland which undergoes crop rotation, including the winter wheat favoured by Brent geese, as confirmed by the county ecologist. Natural England and the RSPB have stipulated that the proposed on-site refuge has to be successfully established before any construction is allowed, but the on-site refuge will only offer grass for food, with unfamiliar landscaping containing a huge raised drainage pond next to the new estate. The on-site refuge will fail and another primary support site will be lost forever to development. Building on this site was completely dependent upon the belief that the protected birds only use the northern part of the field, but important new material evidence clearly shows this is wrong. The course of this application has been perverted. In 2018, the planting regime for the whole field was altered, manipulating Brent geese survey data. As a result, the southern half where the housing is proposed became wasteland just when the Brent goose sightings were required. Fortunately, different crop planting this winter included part of the southern half of the field as well as the northern section, and attracted hundreds of Brent geese to forage on the southern part of this site again. Hampshire and the Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, who objected to the development in 2018, have confirmed this new evidence to consultees, and Barratt Homes' report is out of date. The binding agreement for the future management of these proposed refuges is not finalised. The RSPB is disappointed with Barratt Homes' inconsistencies in their biodiversity report. Barratt Homes incorrectly reported agreed sums of money to create and manage the new habitat. They overclaimed biodiversity net gain by wrongfully including the existing primary support site and omitting the reduction in size. They've still not adhered to the oysters' condition to replace and maintain fencing along the Billy Trail. Planning for wastewater at 110 litres per person per day is nearly 60% less than Bud Farm's average 265 litres, including 3% sewage. If based on the actual figures, it would be increasing the nutrient budget to plus 23, not decreasing it to minus 155. Surely each person creates the same amount of sewage independent of the water that's used. So the reduction in litres of water simply concentrates the sewage and distorts the calculations for nutrient neutrality. This development risks building homes on a future tidal marsh and destroying a successful primary support site, bulldozing through unresolved and unsustainable mitigation based on disputable information for traffic, sewage infrastructure, environmental issues, and a huge number of conditions is unacceptable. It is unethical to agree to propose in order to fulfil a 5-year housing supply and receive money for such mitigation. This committee must display accountability, vote against irreversible damage, and let the inspectorate decide.
You may have to do it again. He's just asked you if you want to do it. Have you?
Hello?
Have
you
unmuted your
finished? Thank you very
microphone?
much for letting me do
No,
my...
Thank you, Ms. Law. I should be grateful if you would please leave the meeting now and take
Thank you.
refuge in the public site. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
You're welcome. Mr. Parham, would you like to make your deputation against this application now?
Thank you, Chair.
Carry on.
In 2013, the inspector advocated restricting housing growth to account for the A3023 capacity limits and flood risks. He and the residents could not possibly have anticipated the council's response, increasing the housing on Hayling by 100% and adding an unknown traffic load on the single access route. The Hayling Island Transport Assessment was commissioned to address the unique constraints caused by the fixed limits of the road network. It is recognised by everyone that there is no economic option to increase this capacity. The peak hour loading at the bridge is approximately 85%, with many periods when the road becomes overloaded and gridlocked, leaving little spare capacity to absorb the increase from HBC's ambitious housing and tourism growth plans. The only independent review of the TA, undertaken by an internationally recognised expert on roads, Professor Nick Hansel, recommended the route be subject to a flow capacity analysis as the correct way to evaluate the impact of the borough's housing development on the island's roads. The data to undertake this analysis is available now. Why has the professional advice been disregarded? Could it be that somebody doesn't want to know? The TA includes a number of mitigation projects which spread the traffic loads round the island but make the A3023 situation worse, as mentioned in 10.4 in the TA addendum. These are mandatory prerequisites to avoid the severe impact predicted in the TA. The current funding is only 17% of the 10.5 million required, and your committee should require a detailed funding analysis as part of the evaluation process for all housing developments, including this one. This is in line with the requirements stated by David Hayward in his address. A second area of concern is coastal protection and the condition of the surrounding waters. Coastal Partners' Hayling Island Coastal Strategy is scheduled for completion in 2022, so no one knows what the future looks like. But options will include contraction of the coastline of the island. It is significant to note that the shoreline adjacent to Sinah Lane is classified as no intervention and threatened by the minimum 1.4 metre tide rise prediction, which in some scenarios could be as high as 1.9 metres. Coastal Partners declined to comment on this application. The water quality surrounding the island is rapidly becoming a national scandal. Serious complaints requiring Southern Water to re-evaluate its processes and stop polluting our beaches and harbours have been raised by Alan Mack MP, Chichester Council, Natural England, harbour authorities, Chichester Harbour Trust, harbour sailing clubs, Hayling Sewage Walks and local support groups. HBC is notably absent from that list. The pollution is primarily generated by discharges of excess screened but untreated wastewater from the sewage network. These occur when the network capacity is reached through rainfall and system failures. Some of these discharges are licensed, some not. In the 11 months from February to December 2020, just for Langstone Harbour, there were 160 discharge events over 75 days, lasting a total of 1,215 hours. We can assume that a similar situation exists in Chichester Harbour. This means that on at least 75 days last year, the blue flag bathing beaches of Wittering, Hayling and Southsea were likely to be contaminated. Alan Mack is supporting a bill which would require Southern Water to stop polluting our two inland waterways. Southern Water have stated that to stop the pollution would require a change in the law and a massive investment, which is not going to happen overnight. Therefore, as it stands, housing development and climate change will inevitably exacerbate the situation and increase pollution, resulting in an unsustainable ecostructure. The minimum requirement should be for Southern Water to provide this committee with a detailed improvement project schedule together with the pollution impact at each stage so that it can accurately inform the development's infrastructure needs. The nitrate reductions claimed for this site and Warblington Farm are purely aspirational. Where is the process to ensure compliance?
Sorry, Mr. Parham, your time is gone. Sorry.
Mr. Parham?
Yes.
Thank you very much for your deputation against the application. I'd ask you if you would be willing now to leave the meeting and join the public website.
Yes.
And it's in the interest of everybody having a say. That's why we restrict the time. Nothing personal, okay? Miss Skennerton, would you like to make your deputation against the application now?
Can you hear me?
I can.
This application's 578 new objections by residents detail crucial local circumstances that the NPPF requires you to heed. Local residents know that groundwater sits 18 inches below the surface. Neighbouring gardens flood after heavy rain, some requiring electric pumps to clear. Can this site be sustainably drained with its fundamental issues of surface plus groundwater build-up? Are you sure that Sinah's new residents will fully understand their responsibility for these, as they are committed to pay a management company whose costs and competence are inevitably uncertain? And there is still no agreement on management of the surface water parts of the suds. It should overflow from the attenuation pond into old overland drainage ditches. These are regularly blocked, needing frequent maintenance, yet run through different land ownerships. This discharge flows through an ancient woodland pond beside the salt marsh sensitive habitat, then into Langstone Harbour. Langstone Harbour objects to this urban development and its damaging effects. Hayling residents live with annual failures of Hayling's sewage pumping network that spill raw sewage into pathways, roads and people's gardens. Sinah's proposed pumping station will add to this failing system. Portsmouth Water mains pipe broke along the A3023 on Hayling, and already twice in 2021 in Hayling's Sinah Lane and Park Road, stopping fresh water from homes at least half a mile distant. Can you guarantee such infrastructure will be sustainable for the development's duration? Proposals for children to walk or cycle to the nearest Hayling schools are fanciful. Whichever route children choose must cross Station, Beach or Manor, possibly St Mary's, then Church Roads. Every single one of these is extremely busy first thing mornings and afternoons. Ever-increasing tradesmen and deliveries exacerbate this situation. St Mary's lacks footpaths. Its on-road parking causes motorists to accelerate past. Local parents strongly object to using Hayling Park as a safe school route. There is ongoing evidence of drug use, small gangs who harass youngsters. Early morning and afternoon walks to school will be on well-screened footpaths. School children would be vulnerable. Crime concerns for the Sinah site highlight the conflict between lighting its concerning crime vulnerabilities and adversely affecting nearby residences. They add the dangers of the Billy Trail, its rural ambience hiding it from open view. So flashers, attacks on dogs and lone individuals are sadly becoming more common. Would you let your children walk or bike to school on that route? The Sinah application is designed to include families, yet refers to distances from schools, retail and facilities as walking distance. Only local knowledge can possibly convey to you that Hayling's central roads plus West Hams are even now incredibly busy. Sinah families will resort to driving their children. So what about air quality and pollution? On those points, only 14.9% of the homes will have charging points. Environmental health questioned why there are no solar panels to mitigate against transport emissions. As for Barratt's own nutrient assessment Appendix B, which uses the figure 110 litres per person per day for wastewater generated, Bud's Farm has calculated an actual 265 litres per person per day. Where is the evidence that Barratt Homes can restrict wastewater production, and who will monitor and confirm it? Without this, their assessment is unsustainable, failing the perpetuity test. With so many serious outstanding issues, please listen to residents and refuse this application. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Skennerton. I should be grateful if you would please leave the meeting now. I presume you do have the link to the public site. Thank you. Mr. Gately, would you, Mr. West and Mr. Seymour now like to make your deputation in support?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
We can.
Good. Good evening, councillors, and thanks to the officer for her thorough report. Before going on to specifics, I'll just quickly recap on the background. You'll remember that a committee was due in March 2020 on our first application, which we originally made in 2018. That was delayed through 2019 whilst the Hayling Island transport assessment was prepared. And although we found resolution on transport this time last year, the first lockdown unfortunately prevented a committee until the point where we had no choice but to go to the inspectorate for non-determination. So we're really pleased that in October, the committee resolved that it would have supported that application, which is now to appeal. And we've actually agreed to pause that appeal pending this committee on our second application. And that ensures a local decision and avoids hopefully the burdens and costs of a hearing on everybody. As the report explains, this application is virtually identical to the original, and we are now much further forward on the Section 106 agreement, and we are expecting to be able to sign that very soon. On to the substance, and firstly the principle. As you've heard, the site is chosen as a housing allocation H29 in the local plan, recently submitted by the council on account of it being sustainable, accessible and suitable. And the principle of developing the site goes back many years now and follows a thorough selection process by your planning officers who looked at all the alternatives across the borough. And it's worth bearing in mind that originally the council earmarked the site for 210 dwellings, not 195, but we have now reached a suitable design and density. Our scheme goes hand in hand with that new allocation policy and meets its aims. This includes especially the environment, with about half the site going permanently to the RSPB. We will create biodiversity net gain, and unusually for this borough, we are nitrate negative. All this means there's no objection from Natural England or the council's ecologist. And combined with other measures on energy efficiency and landscaping and other things, the development is sustainable. Our consultant ecologist will speak on that next. The proposals are also sound in relation to drainage and the water environment, with no objection from the Environment Agency, and our drainage engineer will speak on that subsequently as well. Secondly, there's major social and economic benefit. Investment on the island at this scale is rare, and the boost is all the more important in today's climate. We will be contributing about 1.7 million in community infrastructure levy, which can be spent on a variety of projects at the council's discretion. There'll also be 872,000 specifically towards education, 130,000 towards the Solent Recreation Strategy, 31,000 to health, and nearly 50,000 towards a community worker. Combined, these will provide a real boost to the island. Thirdly, on transport, we realise that highway conditions are difficult, but following much hard work between the county, Havant and ourselves, we've agreed a comprehensive package of highway and transport related contributions for the island, which are in proportion to the development, and they also dovetail with other proposed sites on the island. And this package includes 679,000 towards improvements to the A3023 corridor up to the A27. And as discussed earlier, that's paid by agreed instalments. There's also 35,000 towards improvements to the walking route to the Mengham schools, and a further 8,800 towards upkeep of the Billy Trail. And I'll just quickly address the late holding objection made only today by the countryside officer at Hampshire about the northern link to the Billy Trail. Her main concern was to ensure sensitivity to the local nature reserve there, and we completely agree with that. There's no basic disagreement, we just need to identify the exact specification of the link and the amount needed for its upkeep. We've offered to either build a link and provide us or provide a substantial sum for Hampshire to do so themselves, and we're calculating the figure based on the spec that we received this morning from them. So I should just note again, there's no objection from the council's ecologist, and regarding fencing, we've made repairs this week. And again, our transfer of the land to the RSPB with a capital sum will avoid that issue from recurring. But finally, it's urgent, I'd reiterate, to provide this housing. As your officers have outlined, there's an acute need for Havant to bring forward housing sites because delivery has slipped far below where it needs to be, measured both by the housing delivery test, which is a rearview mirror on what's come forward, and also by the future pipeline over the next 5 years. But this is not obviously about arithmetic, it's about real people's lives, when the need to have space to live has been proven more than ever. Through this development, we'll be providing 58 homes in affordable tenures, both shared ownership and affordable rented, and this is one of the biggest single contributions in the island's history. 137 further households will benefit from property ownership. This will include a mix of 2, 3 and 4 bedroom units to a design that's received your officer's firm endorsement. So I'd commend this scheme and invite committee to reach the same conclusion as it did in October, in line with recommendation in all 3 of the reports that have gone to committee before, and in line with the council's local plan. So I'll hand over next to David West, who's our consultant ecologist.
Thanks, John. So, as you'll have heard, the main interest, ecologically speaking, in relation to this site is really the surroundings, which include a number of European designated sites, including Chitcher and Langston Harbours SPA and Ramsar site, and Maritime SAC. Like all developments in this region, the proposals include a contribution of circa £130,000 to the Solent Recreation Mitigation Strategy, which will mitigate the effects of additional recreation from new residents. The site's listed as H34C in the Solent Wader and Brent Goose strategy, due to the large number of Brent geese which have been predominantly recorded foraging in the northern part of the site when it's been suitably cropped with winter wheat. And one of the really exciting aspects of this scheme is the delivery of a permanent winter bird refuge in the northern half of the site. And we've spent several years designing this with the RSPB, and it's also in accordance with the proposals within the Wader and Brent Goose mitigation strategy. The RSPB will take on the long-term ownership and management of this site to ensure its long-term delivery in perpetuity in accordance with the requirements of the habitats regulations. And since the November submission, a commuted sum for this has now been agreed with the RSPB and is included in the latest submitted version of the strategy. The primary benefits for the birds, and therefore the SPA, is the provision of high-value foraging habitat in the form of a clover-rich grassland. This means that the habitat within the refuge will be suitable every year, rather than being reliant on rotation.
Mr. West, you're suffering from feedback.
Is everyone? Is anyone?
Sorry, Chair. This is your solicitor interrupting. I'm just struggling to follow the deputation. Is this part of the submitted deputation?
Can you answer that, David?
I don't believe so. That's a question for Mr. Gately.
Yeah, we were discussed with Democratic Services, having been given yesterday the opportunity to do 15 minutes, not just 5. So David's just expanding on some of the points that I made originally.
Can we pause the clock? Until we resolve this?
Sorry, Chair. I'm just double checking on what was discussed.
Thank you, Begum.
Right, Mr. Chairman, I've switched onto a pair of headphones with a microphone, so that might improve things a little bit.
It sounds very much better.
Okay, if it's okay, I'll...
Well, hang on, we'll wait for our solicitor to come back.
Fine.
We are pausing your time.
Chair, I've just double checked with committee. What was agreed is that it would be purely on what was in the deputation. So long as it stays on point within the deputation and doesn't go too far off that, then we're happy for the deputy to continue. But it should only be highlighting what is already in the deputation and nothing more.
Thank you, Begum, for your advice. David, be guarded, please. Continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'll just retrace one point then. So the primary refuge, or the primary benefit rather, for the birds and the SPA is the provision of high-value foraging habitat in the form of a clover-rich grassland, which means that the habitat within the refuge will be suitable every year rather than being reliant on crop rotation. This has been agreed by the RSPB, Natural England and others as a suitable habitat and has been used for similar refuge sites such as the Barratt Homes site, Harbour Place and Bedhampton, which has been used this winter by geese. Other works such as fencing and hedgerow planting will also reduce disturbance from the existing informal paths around the site while not denying existing users from continuing to access these. And as the officer's presentation, the county ecologist response set out, this doesn't conflict with the approved mitigation for the oysters development. Another topic which we've heard about is nutrient neutrality. As set out in the officer's presentation, due to the agricultural use of the site and the large areas of open space in the refuge, the scheme results in a large decrease in nitrogen generation of approximately 155.3 kilograms a year, as being calculated in accordance with Natural England's guidance. Not only does this avoid impacts on the European sites, but it's achieved without the need for offsetting or other mitigation, such as that offered by the Borough Council schemes, which means that those options are available for other projects such as brownfield developments which might not be able to achieve neutrality on their own. The site itself has fairly poor biodiversity value consisting of arable fields with small numbers of reptiles, bats and other fauna using the margins with mitigation proposed. With the proposed habitat creation and not including the winter bird refuge, the scheme achieves a net gain for biodiversity using the Natural England 2.0 metric. Additional measures are proposed including bat boxes, bird boxes, etc. to be installed in the site along the boundary. So in conclusion, the proposed development will achieve net gains for biodiversity and a benefit for the European sites. And I'll pass over to Terry Seymour, who's the project engineer.
Good evening all. My name's Terry Seymour. I'm a chartered civil engineer with over 15 years of experience in the design of infrastructure. I appreciate the residents' concerns and share their goal of achieving development free from flood risk. I must stress though that many of the objections stem from misunderstandings. Firstly, flood risk. The Environment Agency's maps confirm that the site lies wholly within flood zone 1. And what that means is that it's in a low risk of flooding from both the sea and the rivers. Our flood risk assessment has been assessed, the risk of flooding from other sources as well, including groundwater and surface water, and has found that the risk to the development is low. It also confirms that the risk elsewhere does not increase. The existing fields will in some instances have water ponding at the surface. This is simply standing rainwater, which is a very common occurrence on many fields across the country during winter months, especially where the soils are clay. This standing water will be dealt with within the new SUDS drainage system. The Environment Agency and the lead local flood authority, who are Hampshire County Council, have reviewed our assessments carefully and raised no objection, subject to standard conditions. These conclusions are also true of tidal influence, which our geotechnical engineers have assessed following extensive groundwater testing and measurements. Regarding surface water, I can clarify that the main below ground surface water network will drain to the northern part of the site, from which point it will be pumped into an attenuation basin beside the winter bird mitigation area. The pumping station will be adopted by Southern Water, and the basin provides temporary storage for peak storm events and then releases the surface water to the existing watercourse at slower greenfield runoff rates. To ensure the required capacity during rainfall events, the basin is above the shallow groundwater and is not compromised by the tides. We have prepared exceedance flow layouts showing that even with pump failure, there will be no flood risk to properties. There is also emergency storage within the surface water network to allow time for engineers to undertake repairs to the pumps in that scenario. Finally, regarding foul water, the main below ground foul water network will drain northward from where it will be pumped into the existing public Southern Water foul sewer to the northwest. The on-site firewater pumping station and main below ground sewers will be adopted by Southern Water. Overall, the drainage proposals are appropriate, sustainable and sound, meeting with the requirements of the expert authorities. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Gately, Mr. West and Mr. Seymour. Sorry about the break. I hope that you feel as though you've been heard sufficiently well. I should be grateful if you now leave the meeting.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Councillor Thomas, would you like to make your deputation now, please?
Thank you, Chairman. Just checking that you can hear me okay.
I can hear you.
First of all, I'd like to thank all of the residents who have commented on the planning application and a few exceptional residents who have trawled through the hundreds of documents and comments in relation to this complicated application and its predecessor. The applicant and officers have had to go to great lengths to attempt to prove the sustainability and suitability of this site, and I believe with the benefit of local knowledge in addition to the report and the supporting documents, it is the wrong application in the wrong place. The proposed development would turn this piece of farmland that is pretty much perched on the edge of Langston Harbour into a housing estate. Let's talk about Brent Geese. Why destroy a greenfield primary support site and create a new smaller one on a site which is less likely to attract the protected species when other fields are still planted with their favourite food? I'm talking about the winter wheat. The site that Barratts now want to develop was not so long ago identified by them as an ideal site for these protected birds just a few years ago. In 2018 and again in 2020, Langston Harbour Board objected to the application in their statutory consultee response. Barratts have recently developed the oysters near to the Sinah Lane site. The site of the current application was at the time identified as mitigation for the oysters. Natural England is clear that the land needed to mitigate land loss to development for these protected birds, and it must not be fragmented and be of adequate size. The proposed solution is fragmented. County Ecology has pressed that mitigation measures must be enforced. Residents remain concerned following failures by Barratts on the oyster site to uphold conditions that protect Solent waders and Brent geese from disturbance, as outlined by Daphne Hayward earlier. The RSPB appear to be increasingly concerned with Barratt's biodiversity report and activity relating to this. Now on to wastewater and flooding. I don't pretend to be an expert on this subject, but fortunately it doesn't take an expert to see the problems right in front of us, from photographic evidence to evidence of contaminated water, and not to mention all of the illegal and legal discharges. Natural England have stipulated conditions regarding the adoption of foul and wastewater drainage by Southern Water and have serious concerns as to Southern Water's ability to address the quality and capacity of infrastructure needed to successfully adopt the sewage and wastewater drainage for the 195 new dwellings. It is well reported that Southern Water are polluting our harbours and that their network fails on a regular basis on Hayling Island. Because of the complexity of the application, I wanted to highlight what the potential of damage to both Chichester and Langston Harbours is high. We are currently dealing with excessive discharges of raw sewage mixed with surface water runoff into both harbours. Data in Natural England's condition review of Chichester Harbour sites, intertidal, subtidal and bird features, this is on the 23rd of February 2021, reveals the extent of the damage to the special protection area salt marsh habitats and eelgrass. Langston Harbour suffers the same issues. Natural England is very concerned about further planning for new developments, yet they can only advise councils. It is important to understand the difference between groundwater and surface water, both of which fall under the remit of Hampshire County Council, the lead local flood authority, not the Environment Agency or coastal partners. The flooding, which is of concern to local residents, is the result of surface water from the rainfall, essentially what you see on the land when it rains, but also the unseen but ever-present groundwater. Groundwater is defined as underground fresh water and is proven to lie very close to the surface of this site, just 45 centimetres below ground level in some areas. This calls into question the feasibility of the drainage technique for use on this site. The claim that the water overflowing from the attenuation pond will be released at the same will be released at the same as current rates is interesting and bemusing to residents. Any directed flow will automatically be greater than it is now, so the rate at which water enters Langton Harbour must be different. Once the proposed attenuation pond reaches capacity, something very likely to happen in winter, the SUDS will need to move water off-site at the same rate and volume generated by precipitation. In the event of filter failure or pump failure, the whole SUDS system could be overwhelmed. It is absolutely unacceptable that the contaminated water could be purposely directed into off-site habitats such as the salt marsh, ancient national ponds, but will eventually end up draining into Langton Harbour. This is similar to what happens to Southern Water's raw sewage after heavy rainfall in what some describe as a licensed discharge. Others would describe this as a reasonably foreseeable failure of planning and insufficient infrastructure capacity. Certainly not a starting point for development. The proposal was clearly not a suitable development. The drainage plan represents a threat to the surrounding off-site environment, including the adjacent dwellings, and needs highly professional maintenance. The mitigation for ecology and the transport network will not prevent a severe impact from this development. Currently, the site floods with a vast volume of surface water rainfall, particularly in the winter months. It sits on the field and only disperses by evaporation or slow seepage into the soil. This is limited as the soil is waterlogged and groundwater lies close to the surface, so the water table is very high. There are drainage ditches, however, these require farmer intervention as these are often blocked and clogged. As I already mentioned, there is a proposed attenuation pond for the storage of surface water. However, when this reaches capacity, something more likely in winter, the stored surface water will be directed to an overflow off-site. This is likely to be a much faster rate and volume after heavy rainfall, very much like the excessive discharges we have seen this winter into Langton Harbour. We have been shown irrefutable evidence from residents who live around the proposed site with their gardens flooding in winter. This is without any added development. These residents need a miniature SUDS drainage system before we begin to look at what is required for any new developments. As a council, we have talked a lot recently about nutrient neutrality, we are paving the way, etc., etc. But are we, is the question residents are asking. Filtration is part of the proposed mitigation, but if it is overwhelmed, the overflow leaving the site will contain pollutants and nutrients from households and building processes. This means that the very nutrients we are trying to prevent will reach the harbour in much bigger quantities than now. We know the rates and volume of this overflow has been calculated regarding the surface water, but has the modelling taken into account the groundwater bulge trapped in the sediments underground, which will rise due to the forces created with more water in the harbour due to the predicted 1.4 metre tidal rise? If you, like me, find these details difficult to visualise, you may be surprised that this application is informed not by an independent hydrogeologist, but by Barratt's appointed engineer. Surely we should not allow relatively unproved drainage solutions to perch precariously close to a special protection area where an unfiltered surface water could pass through the salt marsh and reach Langton Harbour. In summary, the proposal is not a sustainable development. Any point of failure or extreme event could threaten the surrounding off-site environment, including the adjacent dwellings. This site should not be looked at in isolation without linking to the wider mitigation issues, e.g. infrastructure for traffic, drainage infrastructure, etc. As we've said time and time again, Hayling Island is unique. The officer report suggests that the planning balance, including the issues of 5-year housing supply, tilt the decision to be to permit, but enough environmental and hydrogeological concerns remain to tilt the other way. David Hayward said it himself earlier, the council should grant planning permission unless any adverse impacts of doing so would significantly and demonstratively outweigh the benefits when assessed against the policies in the MPPF as a whole. Well, I hope that myself and the residents and Councillor Satchwell, who was speaking after me, have demonstrated to you the significant and adverse effects should this planning application be granted. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you, Councillor. Now, we've been going nearly 2 hours, so I'm going to adjourn the meeting for 5 minutes to take everyone to take a comfort break. We shall reconvene in 5 minutes' time and then go on. If the meeting reaches 9 o'clock and we have not finished, the meeting will again be adjourned and called for a future date to continue, according to the general practice of the committee. So, Mark, if you please note that we'll take a 5-minute break as of now.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, it's noted, and could I please ask all members that the broadcast is still live. So if you could all please mute your microphones during this time, I'll be grateful.
Mark, please stand by. We'll reconvene in 15 seconds.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Right, Mark, the meeting is again in session.
We appear to have lost Councillor Robinson at the moment. Let's see if I can get a hold of her.
Councillor Thomas?
Robinson.
Robinson, oh.
Yeah.
Are you making any progress with that?
Not at the moment, Mr. Chairman. I'm struggling to get a hold of her.
I noticed her microphone's unmuted, but perhaps she's gone offline.
Yes, she's not in the call at all. If you give me just a few seconds, I'll see if I can give her a call.
Okay.
Councillor Robinson, can we just test your microphone?
Yes, I lost you all there for a little while.
Thank you. Glad you're back. If you'd like to mute, please.
Excellent. Right, we can start again then, Mark. I think Councillor Thomas, you've probably left the meeting now, but if you haven't, please do so and take up the public access application. Councillor Satchwell, would you like to make your deputation now, please?
Yeah, yes, please. Thank you. Just checking you can hear me.
I can.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, members, for this opportunity to address you. I do not envy you your task this evening. This is probably one of the most complicated and highly contested applications that I have seen in my nearly 6 years as a councillor and 5 years on the planning committee. There is no question that officers have worked tirelessly to try and find a way that, in their opinion, tips the planning balance to the recommendation to grant permission. Tonight, you have heard dramatic words like demonstrably, which I actually had to look up. It's a complicated way of saying in a way that is clearly apparent or capable of being logically proved. And perhaps other unfamiliar words that are part of the planning process will be heard this evening. I urge members of the planning committee to take advantage of the planning experts assembled this evening and to ask any and as many questions as you need to. I welcomed the Councillor Guest's support at the site briefing, confirming the same. It is essential that you understand the complexities of this application before you vote. Please be in no doubt that the decision you make today is a decision that affects tens, if not hundreds of thousands of borough residents and visitors. Emergency services often struggle to enter and leave the island, and that quite frankly is not acceptable, or more to the point, sustainable. I keep reminding myself it is not the local plan on trial tonight, but the Hayling Island Transport Assessment, which forms part of the emerging local plan, does inform this application. The transport assessment is just that, an assessment. It details what may be potentially possible. It is written as part of the local plan process, where a holistic examination of the whole plan in public is intended. Following this full examination of the current local plan in public in 2013, which in fairness was pre the MPPF, the inspectors commented as follows: I concur that growth on Hayling Island should be limited, restricted to take into account flood risk and the need to minimise impacts on natural environment of Chichester and Langstone harbours and access difficulties on the local road network at peak hours. I could not have said it better myself. Many residents have asked me what in real terms will be delivered to improve the network by developers should this application go ahead. We heard earlier from Mrs Hayward a long list of proposed improvements, but I'd like to dig a little deeper so there are no misunderstandings. The developer has to pay in the region of £2.4 million in total contributions, but only £679,000 for highways. Taking a brief look at the transport assessment again, I turn to the early intervention measures and what contributions that this application might provide. The transport addendum identifies 10.6 million in early intervention measures and a further 2.3 million in later intervention schemes. So let's take a look at what the transport assessment identified as transport mitigation. So West Lane, Priority Junction, sounds really exciting, particularly if you live on Hayling, but oh no, that's estimated at £1.8 million. Mitigation package M1A North, friction reduction. This is junction and bus stop improvements that come at an estimated 1.5 million. North Knee Road, folded right turns at 780,000. So mitigation package M1A South looks to be in budget potentially at 679,000 just to update 4 bus stops or 4 junction improvements. This is an assessment of what might be possible. So clearly the 700,000 will deliver no known improvements, but it could deliver improvements to 4 bus stops or junctions. I am at a loss to why the extensive officer's report fails to set out what should be delivered and when. I understand that we are in the hands of the Highway Authority, but why do members of this committee not get to know this before deciding the application? Update papers alarmed me further. They state that the first instalment of £67,000 will allow the Highway Authority to trigger design work on a number of improvements along the A3023, as identified in the Hayling Island Transport Assessment, and to have a better understanding of the detail of these schemes and the cost to prioritise them. Why is this work not being done before permission, or at the very least fully satisfied as a condition before any work can start? Is mitigation even possible? So basically nobody knows what, how much or where. I find this unacceptable for an application on the island that has 1 road on and 1 road off. We frequently hear the Highway Authority is satisfied and therefore it is not a reason for a refusal. However, residents deserve to know more before permission is granted. In the technical note issued on the 15th of March 2020 by the planners following the call to scrutiny of the Cabinet decision to publish the Transport Assessment Addendum, our own planners said the Hayling Island Transport Assessment concluded that with new development but without mitigation, the local plan proposals would lead to cumulative severe impact on the road network. Government legislation is in favour of sustainable development unless material considerations indicate otherwise, and here they do. I would like to draw members' attention to R170 on page 57 of their Model Reasons for Refusal booklet. The proposed development would result in additional vehicles regularly entering and leaving Hayling Island, thereby interfering with the safety and free flow of traffic on the A3023 route. It is therefore contrary to policies CS16, CS19, CS20 and DM13 and 14 of the Havant Borough Council Core Strategy 2011, which forms part of the Local Development Framework Planning Policy Statement 1 and Planning Policy Guidance 13. Moving on to birds and wildlife, we've heard from other deputies about the many issues that remain. Looking at this in summary, there's clear new evidence that protected birds do use the southern part of the site. The whole site for this application is currently officially designated support site for Brent geese and waders. So the application is trying to mitigate the already mitigated from the oysters. So there is a site mitigation for the site and the site mitigation for the mitigation. It makes no common sense. There are conditions that mean birds need more land, and the condition requires E26 to be part of the mitigation, which also requires it to be adjacent. It is not. A contribution from the RSPB reminds us of why there is so much concern. The application site lies within 150 metres of Langton Harbour to the west, a designated site of special scientific interest, and forming part of the Chichester and Langton Harbour Special Protection Area. It just is not the right site. There is no agreement in place between the developer and the RSPB, and the cost and time of delivery of a long-term solution is in question. Why are we looking at this application without this being fully resolved? I would like to draw members' attention to R61 in their model reasons. The proposal represents the undesirable addition of dwellings in an area of countryside close to a site of special scientific interest that forms part of the Chichester and Langton Harbour Special Protection Area, for which there is no overriding justification, which is contrary to policy CS19, CS17 and of the core strategy and the planning policy statements 1, 3 and 7. Infrastructure is of course a huge concern, but whilst I have covered the transport side, the concerns are far more widespread. You've heard from colleagues about the ongoing and consistent problems that we have with Southern Water and Bud's Farm. Bud's Farm fails regularly, and evidence of raw sewage is aplenty for on our harbours and beaches. I recall a video of the leader of the council witnessing for himself the debris, for want of a better word, of one of the many releases. In 2022, the Coastal Partners Hayling Island Coastal Strategy is anticipated. This strategy will be invaluable of helping to understand whether further development of Hayling is sustainable. Surely a flat island with little or no flood protection needs this, so to truly make an informed decision on whether development is sustainable. In Mrs. Hayward's presentation this evening, she stated that there was no problem with flooding, or we would know that from houses in North Shore Road would be affected. Since this meeting began, I have had confirmation from number 42, 44 and 45 that they have to use electric pumps in that road because of flooding issues. I've not clearly surveyed all residents in this road, but it sounds like we need to, as assumptions have been made, and that no one suffers from flooding in North Shore Road. All of these things need to be considered by an inspector as part of examination of the local plan with community involvement. There are many material planning considerations that indicate why this application should be reviewed. These quite clearly all tip towards prematurity. I refer members again to page 52 and R122. The site forms part of an area which should be developed on a comprehensive basis, and the proposal would represent an undesirable form of piecemeal development that is likely to prejudice the future development on Hayling Island. We must not lose the opportunity for development on Hayling Island that is sustainable, is truly in keeping with its surrounding areas, or development that has integrity at its heart and factors in the long-term well-being of the current and future residents that may occupy it. I urge you to refuse this application this evening.
Thank you, Councillor Satchwell. I should be grateful if you would now please leave the meeting. That concludes the public deputations. Do the officers have any comments to make on the deputations and comments received before I ask the members to ask any questions?
Thank you, Chair. I will comment briefly. Many of the issues that I would have sought to comment on have already been referred to in the presentation.
And I would prefix my comments with the fact that you will have noted from my presentation and from the report that we do consult with the relevant statutory and non-statutory consultees, because they are the experts in this matter, and therefore their opinion is valued. So in terms of the RSPB, and you will see on page 38 of your report where they provide a further comment that they are now in a situation where they have received updated information, and they, subject to completing a legal agreement on which they are negotiating, that they have no further comments. Excuse me, Chair. Right, in respect to the highways considerations, you will see that in Appendix E of this report there is very detailed comments taken from the previous application, the 2018 application, which gives you a summary of the extensive consultations and negotiations between the Highway Authority and the developer in recognition of the complexities of the highway situation, and you will be aware that the Highway Authority does not object to this proposal. In terms of coastal protection, I would flag up that both the coastal team and the RSPB have been made aware of the concerns about erosion, and that the impact or potential impact on the bird refuse, they are aware of this. That has not resulted in them raising objection. In terms of water quality, I can advise that Southern Water, it is the responsibility of Southern Water, and you will see on page 15 they advise, or Southern Water advise, that they can provide sewage disposal to serve the development. In terms of pumps for the pumping station, or in terms of the pumping station, Southern Water is to adopt that. Regarding the ditches, yes, they are the responsibility of the landowner to maintain, and they are policed by the lead local flood authority. Again, in terms of the drainage, the proposal incorporates holding tanks, large holding tanks, as well as the attenuation basin, which have been designed to accommodate the surface water.
Could you repeat the last bit? There was too much noise on the background.
Yes, apologies, that's my issue. Okay, so the ditches, sorry, the holding tanks and the attenuation basin have been designed to accommodate the proposed drainage, having regards to sea level rises and also the lifetime of the development. Right, I would advise that in terms of the pump for the surface water drain, there is also an additional pump now provided as a fallback in case the main pump fails, and this is following negotiations with the lead local flood authority. Both the HRA and AA was subject with consultation with Natural England. It did consider the drainage, SUDS drainage aspect, and it was agreed by Natural England. So therefore, they are satisfied that the proposed SUDS arrangements are not a pollution issue. In terms of the matter of flooding and the fact that this development lies beyond North Shore Road, and therefore that it is going to be less likely to experience flooding or water pressure than properties in North Shore Road. I'm also advised that actually there is a sewer that runs along North Shore Road, and this would actually provide a positive path for any surface water or any water, and this extends north-south. Therefore, any issues in terms of surface water on the application site relate to the water from rain, etc., that falls on the application site, rather than the pressure driving water further inland from the coast. Thank you, Chair. To conclude, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Hayward. Right. I shall now invite any member who wishes to ask a question to unmute their microphone. Are there any questions?
Chair, would it be possible to add a small matter following the deputations before we move to questions?
Certainly. Go ahead, David.
Thank you. The one point I would just like to raise is that there has unsurprisingly been a number of comments made regarding the emerging Havant Borough local plan and its examination, and I would just like to remind the committee that the matter before them is the specific planning application at Sinah Lane and not the local plan overall, and the cumulative impact of development on Hayling Island. That will be addressed in due course through the local plan's examination. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that clarification, David. I go back to where we were. I shall now invite any member who wishes to ask a question to unmute their microphone. Are there any questions? If so, please unmute your microphone. We've got Councillor Robinson.
Yes, thank you, Chair. One of my concerns is the lack of mitigation for nutrient pollutions. I'm well aware that agricultural land is a big producer of nutrient pollution, but we're adding nearly 200 homes, dwellings onto this site, which in themselves will produce effluents, and I'm really struggling to see why no mitigation has been put in place for any further pollution that may be caused by this development.
At the end of, was that a question?
Well, yes, I really don't understand why there is no mitigation for it. It says that it's a minus, and they're saying by taking it out as agricultural land and making it into, you know, building land, that you know, we've eradicated that problem. And I didn't, on my time on dealing with the nutrient pollution issue, I didn't think it was actually that simple. But I also worry that there are many fears and concerns of residents, which is understandable. Should any of these concerns come to fruition, who will take responsibility for it?
Would the officers like to respond?
Chair, is it possible for me to respond on the first point with regards to the nutrient question with regards to the budget itself?
Who's speaking?
Jill Glover, Planning Policy Officer.
Certainly.
Thank you. In answer to your question, Councillor Robinson, the nutrient load for a cereal crop is relatively high compared to a new urban area. So an urban nutrient load is lower than what is a cereal crop. Therefore, that is why it does not require mitigation, because development produces less nutrient load than a cereal crop.
I think a point of clarification there. Jill, would be that crops need a lot of fertiliser, and a lot of that fertiliser leaches through the soil and into the water, causing bloom, whereas a housing estate offers less such contamination.
Indeed. So in Natural England's methodology, a cereal crop produces 31.2 kilograms per hectare of nutrients, and for the councillor's benefit, in terms of what the urban area provides, it's 14.3 kilograms per hectare. So it's basically half of a cereal crop.
Thank you for that. Councillor Pike.
Thank you, Chairman, and can I thank Mrs. Hayward for her very comprehensive report and her work on this application. Just one clarification from me, and I did raise this at the site view, and I think it's important that we understand this and those listening in understand this. Can you please confirm what regard this committee should have for the decision of the previous committee on the previous application as to what it would have done should the appeal not have gone ahead? Could somebody just put that on the record so we're absolutely clear whether we should have regard for that decision? Thank you.
Chairman, if I could come in, it's Julia Manzi on that answer.
By all means.
Thank you. The decision made by the council back in October, when the committee resolved what they would have decided had they been able to determine that application, is a material consideration when you're looking at the current proposal, because the applications are almost identical. You have to ask yourselves what has changed in the interim time. We are still working to the same local plan, although the emerging local plan has been submitted to the inspectorate. It does not carry any more weight. All of the plans remain the same except for the 5-year land supply, which is now in a much worse situation than it was back in October. So you are in a worse situation in terms of the planning balance, in that it is now more in favour of approving this application than the one in October. So my advice to the committee is that you should be consistent. I know there has been a change of membership of the committee, but it is still the committee as a whole that is making this decision. And the decision of this committee in October last year was that they would have granted permission. Therefore, my question goes back to you again, what has changed? Because if anything, you are in a slightly worse situation. I trust that clarifies the point, Councillor Pike.
Thank you, Julian. I think it's important both the committee understand that and also those people listening to the public broadcast. Thank you.
Thank you for that exchange. Councillor Keast.
Thank you, Chairman. Part of it has really been answered, my question. I was going to ask a question of who is responsible for the ditches. No names were given. Could you tell us who would actually be responsible for them? And secondly, knowing the island reasonably well, I do recall that when I lived at the north of the island, when the tide was in, our garden flooded, and when the tide went out, it didn't, or it drained. And I also remember a planning application going back about 12, 15 years ago towards East Stoke area, where we had exactly the same problem. When the tide was in, there was a flood, and when it went out, it cleared. Is this the case here? Is there a sort of a relaxing of the flooding when the tide goes out? Can anybody tell me that, please?
Officer, like to respond?
I'm referring particularly now, obviously, to the field as it stands at the moment.
Who would like to respond to that, please?
Chair, I'll respond on the first part, and that is Hayling Island builders own the site, but they have been renting it out to farmers. So the responsibility would be the Hayling Island builders, but I expect that maybe that responsibility is passed on to whoever farms the land. In terms of if any ditches on the of the Hayling Billy within the Hampshire County Council land, then Hampshire County Council would be responsible for that. In terms of the flooding with high tide, I'm unclear whether we are talking about an inland site or a site which is actually adjoining the coast.
Daphne, if I can take over there, it's Julia Manzi again.
Thank you.
The specific ditch that would take surface water drainage away from this site, where it drains into the harbour to the north of the proposed bird refuge, there is a non-return flap which prevents the tide from coming up the ditch. Therefore, water is held in the ditch until the tide drops to a certain point and the flap can open again to release the water. It's like a non-return valve. The scheme proposes a second non-return valve further to the south along the ditch, which would prevent any surface water in the ditch joining the attenuation pond. So that would prevent backflow into any of the surface water system on the site, should the ditch be full where it's held back with the tide. So you won't have the tidal surges into the ditch because those flaps would prevent it. So as soon as the tide drops away, the ditch can drain again out into the harbour. Does that answer your question, Councillor Keast?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to just go back to the first one. We were saying that Hayling Island builders currently own the site and let it out to farmers. So if this all goes through, then the property is sold to Barratt's. Who then is responsible? Is it Barratt's responsible for the ditches? And when they've completed the site, who is responsible then?
The ditch lies outside the development site.
Right.
Therefore, it would remain the builders maintaining it, but the enforcing authority to ensure it is maintained is Hampshire County Council as the lead flood authority.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. That explains it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that exchange. Very helpful. Councillor Husky Patel.
Thank you, Chair. Just more of a comment and a question as well, really. My concerns around flooding and drainage, and especially in the report on page 49, it says anyone buying the property will be jointly liable for the cost of expert maintenance and management. Given that the drainage and flooding is an issue in the area, why haven't we gone out to an independent surveyor to get the report? Why are we relying on Barratt's report? That's one. And the second part was Southern Water adopting the pumping station. Is that confirmed or is that still in plan? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Would someone like to respond to that, officers?
Chairman, if I take the first question that Councillor Patel raised, which is Steve Weaver speaking, yeah. With regard to the submission of the report, it's not simply a case that we take the report and automatically agree whatever its findings might be when the developer gives it to us. As I hope Mrs. Hayward's presentation would have set out, and as the order papers show, there's a considerable amount of statutory and non-statutory consultation that happens, and when it comes to surface water matters, that's directly with the lead local flood authority, which is Hampshire County Council. So they're certainly independent of Barratt's, they're independent of the engineers who commissioned the report, and they're independent of us. So we certainly do use other bodies and in layman's terms, don't just take the developer's word for it. On the pumping station adoption, if I can ask Mrs. Hayward to clarify the current position on that.
Thank you. The current position on the adoption of the pumping station is that in principle Southern Water have agreed to adopt it. This would need to be the subject of a formal agreement between Barratt's and Southern Water. It is not, however, a requirement that Southern Water adopt it. It can and often is actually maintained by a management company, but in this case Southern Water have agreed to adopt it, subject to that undertaking. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Councillor Husky, are you satisfied with that response?
I am, thank you.
Thank you. I see, Councillor Robinson, you were unmuted. Are you wishing to speak?
Yes, please. Just my second point. I see that only 26 of the 195 houses will have garages, and yet there's no infrastructure going to be put in place for electric charging. Now, you know, we have a national policy in terms of vehicle use, and we're going to do away with diesel and petrol, and I just wonder whether there should be some form of recommendation that that an infrastructure for vehicle charging is put in, taking into account that it's not so far in the future that we won't have diesel and petrol vehicles. They will be all electric. Also, as a sustainable development, I wonder why the houses have not got solar panels on the ceilings. Thank you.
Well, I've got to say, we're not here to design it. It's presented as it is, and we have to consider on its own merits.
I see, okay. Thank you, yeah.
Well, this is something always to be remembered, but if an officer would like to respond to that, to be helpful and open about this.
Yes, thank you, Chair. As a council, we are trying to encourage measures like that, and that's why that particular requirement has been provided or set out in the emerging plan. However, that plan is at the pre-submission stage. There is a high level at the submission stage. There is a high level objection to that policy. I would say mainly from house builders, but that is the situation, and therefore we can only give limited weight to that policy at that stage. Should the inspector support the council in confirming that policy, then we will be in a much better position to require the provision of such things as the electrical vehicle charging points and other measures for sustainability. And that is certainly the direction that the council would wish to see that go. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
I see no other unmuted microphones in members.
You do.
Who's that? Councillor Keast, I'm sorry. Yes.
Thank you, Chairman. On the distances, you showed us one of the slides showed us number 10 Sinah Lane, which is, I think, is just by the entrance. When we looked at the distances there, the distance that was shown was one to the right of the design of the actual plan, and that was obviously was a greater distance than the one at number 10. Could you just confirm that the distance number 10 is within or exceeds our requirements of 20 metres, please? That's particularly number 10 Sinah Lane.
Councillor Mrs Hayward, would you like to answer that? Sorry,
Thank you, Chairman.
Sorry, I promoted you there, sorry.
When you showed us that particular slide, that the measurement was against one of the properties to the right, which obviously had a longer garden.
Thank you, Chair. The measurement would have been the back-to-back distance, which needs to comply with the Borough Design Guide in terms of the 20 metre. Where we have a side-on relationship, we do allow a lesser distance of 10 metres. This proposal complies with those requirements in respect to all of the plots, including that plot and that existing property. Thank you, Chair.
Right. Okay. If there are no other questions, I please ask all members to unmute their microphones. Thank you. We shall now proceed to the debate. I shall now ask each member of the committee who wishes to speak or propose a motion to unmute their microphone. I shall then ask each member of the committee who has unmuted their microphone to speak in turn. When a member has finished their contribution to the debate, he or she should mute their microphone. Could I please ask the members to propose motions or amendments during the debate and not wait until the end? This will make the proceedings more understandable to everybody listening. As soon as a motion or amendment has been proposed, I shall ask for a seconder. I would remind members that as soon as a motion has been proposed and seconded, the debate should only relate to this motion. I would remind the members that if they are minded to refuse an application contrary to officer advice, they must clearly state their reasons for refusal. If a member wishes to add conditions not recommended by the officers, that member shall be asked to give their reasons for this new condition. These reasons will be noted by the officers. I shall now ask any member who wishes to speak to unmute their microphone. I have no, oh, I'm sorry, Councillor Pike, yes.
Sorry, Chairman, I hope you don't mind me going first.
I think you're the only one that's unmuted at the moment.
I think, as Councillor Satchwell highlighted during her deputation, this is a very complex matter and one we take very seriously. There is some very strong arguments on both sides. If you could see a pack of papers, you see a very large number of post-it notes within them with all of the issues that concern me and that are weighing on one side or the other. I think clearly one thing we do not hear strongly from the deputies, which I think we should do, is much more about the need for housing, and clearly we have it within our policies, but you know, as a matter of the current population figures, it's roughly a growth of about 80 residents a year on Hayling Island, and if people want to stay on Hayling Island, they need somewhere to live, and we should be aiming to allow that to happen, and we should also be making sure that affordable housing is delivered. And I do give great weight to the fact that this development will deliver housing and will deliver 58 affordable housing. But I also think there are matters on the other side that cause me great concern. I think, just thumbing through my post-it notes here, I think I agree with Councillor Robinson that the fact that the developer is not choosing to put electric vehicle charging in every site is just limiting their market for the future and is unsatisfactory. I think the goose refuge will have issues. I clearly know quite a lot about geese, and I think the combination of having the goose refuge with quite considerable public access around the perimeter will limit its success, and I hope that the RSP will come back to us should they find that the refuge is not working as well as it could do, if there are conflicting issues. I also think that many of the residents are very correct to raise issues, for example, with the sewage, but I don't see this application as being the right way of dealing with a strategic infrastructure issue, which it certainly is. The local plan is the right place to do that, and to hold, in this case, Southern Water to account, which this council should be doing and others should be doing, but it's not the job of this application to resolve that matter. Finally, on the matters of infrastructure, I listen, as I always do, carefully to Mr. Parham and others about the infrastructure matters, and what concerns me most is connecting the contributions that are made with actually delivery of the infrastructure improvements. And I think Councillor Satchwell illustrated that point as well. You know, we know it ourselves from previous developments. My experience being, for example, with a development which also happens to be incidentally Barratt's in Warblington, where they made a substantial contribution to the County Council in 2013 for a footbridge at Warblington Station. But the councils have failed to deliver that 8 years later, despite all the homes being occupied 4 or 5 years ago. And so it may not be for the developer on this site to deliver that infrastructure, but we need to ensure that the infrastructure is delivered in order for this development to be sustainable. It's very clear that if we do not get the infrastructure improvements, then the development will not be sustainable. So we need to do better at connecting those two things together. How we can do that through this process, I'm not sure. Whether we need to the councils to work quicker, better together to ensure that infrastructure is delivered. Otherwise, I think residents will rightly be concerned that we have a history of it within the borough of not keeping up with infrastructure, and this has the potential to be the same thing. So my preference would be to make a stronger link with the infrastructure if there is a way of doing it. Although I understand from the questions I've raised with officers that the contribution is pretty much the only way of doing so. But I would be interested in other members' views on the matters I've raised. Thank you, Chairman.
Well, thank you, Councillor Pike. Of course, Havant Borough Council, for the awareness of the public listening to this meeting, do not construct infrastructure. That is not our responsibility as a local council. Infrastructure is provided by the county. In the case of the railway footbridge that Councillor Pike mentioned, that is a matter for Network Rail, who are taking a long time to come around to cooperate and agree to do it. So it's outside the actual remit of the council to get these things done. But of course, we can all, as local councillors, apply pressure at every opportunity to make sure we get delivery as promised. Now, Councillor Keith, you're unmuted.
Thank you, Chairman. I too agree that we've had some very good presentations this evening, and particularly from the residents. And it's really interesting to listen to the variation of comments which were made. However, we have to consider that at a previous meeting, this application was approved. So we need to just look at what has actually changed since the last application. And the changes are very, very little. Some of the properties have actually been moved slightly away from the boundary, which is a plus factor, I would think, in most people's eyes. And secondly, the footprint of the properties hasn't changed basically at all. It's only a change of the design. So compared to the previous application, which was approved, there is very little change. I'm afraid I'm therefore going to have to say that I would support permission being granted on this particular application.
Thank you, Councillor. Can I ask for a seconder? Then I will second it in the absence of anyone else. So the proposal is that permission be granted for this application. Do the officers have any comments to make based on the debate so far? If those, please unmute your microphone now. I shall now repeat the process to enable councillors to make any further comments. If a councillor wishes to speak again, please unmute your microphone now. Councillor Pike.
Thank you, Chairman. I think I think we should appreciate the great concern that residents have about this, and that we need to do better as a council to make sure that we follow through on it. I visited the site myself last week, and it was quite obvious that the follow through from the mitigation from the previous development was not being carried out, and therefore that counts against, for me, that this developer has not followed through on the mitigation plan that they had signed up to with the Oysters development. So I really hope that, I know that residents will help us to do this, that they will ensure that all of the aspects that this site needs in order to be sustainable development are carried through, and that residents continue to help us by monitoring those things and bringing them forward to ensure that they happen. Because I would agree with your overall assessment. I believe that sustainable development is possible on this site, and therefore I'm going to vote in favour of your motion. But the sustainable development is only possible on this site with a very large number of caveats, and those caveats need to be followed through to a conclusion. And so I would urge those residents who are listening to this to help us to do that, and to bring forward concerns both during the construction and the occupation phases to ensure that all of those things that make this development qualify as sustainable actually come through to fruition as quickly as the houses do. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor. Officers, would you like to add anything? If so, speak up. Okay, Mr. Gregory, would you please advise if any motions and/or amendments have been proposed and seconded, and could the planning officers please clarify the conditions or reasons attached to these motions or amendments?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, the proposal is to grant permission as recommended in the report, subject to the amendments set out in the supplementary papers.
Thank you. Before I take a vote, could the planning officers please clarify the conditions or reasons?
Thank you, Chairman. Steve Weaver. Yes, you've got the recommendations set out in your order papers. So it's subject to a Section 106 agreement covering the matters set out in paragraph 7.102 of your order papers. And then it's subject to the conditions that are set out on pages 74 through to 81 of your agenda papers, with 2 amendments. Firstly, condition 9, which is amended as per your update sheet 2. That's just an amendment to the wording, and subject to an additional condition. So there are now 25 conditions in total relating to the noise levels associated with working practices. So with those amendments, Chairman, the recommendation and the motion is to grant permission. Thank you.
Thank you. I shall now move to the vote and ask each member of the committee in turn whether they are for, against, or wish to abstain. I'm voting for. Councillor Keast?
For.
Councillor Lowe?
For.
Councillor Patel?
For.
Councillor Pike?
For.
Councillor Robinson?
For.
Councillor Mrs. Shimbart?
Abstain.
Thank you. Mr. Gregory, could you please read out the results of the vote?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that was 6 in favour of the proposal and 1 abstention. So the application is granted permission.
I thank you for that. I hereby declare that the application APP/20/01093 has been granted permission. I shall now proceed to the next item. Item 4 on the agenda, appointment of site viewing working party. Members, it is recommended that we appoint a site viewing working party with the terms of reference set out in paragraph 3.1 of the submitted report, appoint all members of the planning committee, including standing deputies, to this working party, and agree that all members appointed to this working party continue to be members and constitute this working party until the first meeting of this committee after the annual meeting of the council, subject to the members concerned remaining members of the council during that time. Do we have a proposer?
Yes, happy to propose, Chairman, as on the order paper.
Councillor Pike, thank you. Seconder?
Second.
Who's that?
I'll second that, Chair.
Who's seconding? Who's seconding?
Councillor Patel.
Councillor Patel?
Okay.
Does any member wish to oppose this? Is this agreed? I'll take it as yes unless there's a nay. I hereby declare this meeting closed and thank all people involved for their hard work and dedication.